Marianne Walter, the floor is yours. The title of your presentation is Darleen and Darnisha, Race, Gender, and Phonological Patterns in American Given Names. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, Mirko, and thanks to all of you for coming at whatever time it is where you are. Is everything all right with the sound and the screen share?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Okay, so in my presentation today and in this project, I'm looking at a couple of very well established already effects of gender and also ethnicity in first names in American English, but putting them together in a new way, as far as I know, for the first time. So we already know that there are gender-based phonological patterns in given names in English specifically, but not only English. And there's at least one talk on this in this very conference. So we know this for English, for Chinese and other languages. Names associated with female gender have certain phonetic characteristics. One of them is prosodic, so they're more likely to have more open syllables, meaning only vowel or consonant vowel, no closing consonant, and a higher percentage of vowels in general in the word, compared to male names and compared to the lexicon as a whole as well. And there are also a couple of segmental criteria. One of them is about vowel quality, so more often a higher percentage of high front vowels, E and I sounds. And when it comes to consonants, they're more likely to include the so-called sonorant consonants, which are listed for you here, L, R, M, N, W, and Y. There are also well-known patterns involving race-based differences in names in the American context. And these have been described primarily in the sociological and economics literature rather than the linguistics literature. But that's shown that there are definitely ethnicity associated names in terms of being Black or white sounding names for both men and women in the American context. And people are quite good actually at identifying ethnicity from a first name. That's been shown as well experimentally. And there are various knock-on effects, very unfortunate ones in terms of willingness to rent properties, offer employment, and so on. So because of the different field of these studies, there's been a lot of focus on the social implications and the identification of specific names as being more or less Black or white, and not the same kind of focus on phonetic characteristics that we've seen with the gender criterion in the linguistics literature. So what are we going to do today? First, see whether we see the same phonetic patterns within the Black community in the United States as we see generally cross-linguistically and also for the white names, and then look at the interaction of these two factors. And as far as I know, it's the first consideration of these phonetic factors, especially for the Black names. And it's really predicted that we'll see some differences because of the intersecting social stereotypes about race and gender, which already exist in American society. So there are various social roles, such as the angry Black woman or the sassy Black friend or the Black male buck, which involve this intersection. And according to these social stereotypes, Black women are less feminine compared to white women. So the pinnacle of femininity is supposed to be the blonde white woman. Or maybe Black women are not even considered women. There's the very famous quotation or possibly misquotation of abolitionist activist Sojourner Truth, who says, "Ain't I a woman?" implying that not everyone would agree that she is. And on the other hand, Black men are quite masculine compared to white men, but threateningly so. They're masculine in an aggressive and hostile manner. So the movie poster is here because King Kong was widely seen as a kind of metaphor for interracial marriage and the dangers that it posed to white American society. And we can see very clearly displayed here the contrast between the ideal of white femininity and the threat of Black masculinity. So clearly, we might expect to see some reflections of these attitudes in the names, since we're testing in a way for degree of femininity and masculinity perceived femininity and masculinity according to these phonetic criteria. Okay, so these stereotypes are well established enough to have their own Wikipedia entries, which is of course no guarantee of truth, but just shows that they're out there and people know about them and to some extent at least believe them. And also in pop culture and kind of what you see when you search for an emotional person will be a white woman, because Black women are meant to be strong, not emotional. But sassy, on the other hand, which means threatening at the same time. Okay, so we'll start first by looking only at the Black names and comparing male and female Black names to see if we see this same gender-associated pattern within the Black community. So this is using one data set based on names given to children, Black children in Illinois. So these are the names which are given only to Black children and never to white children in Illinois during a certain time period. And the researchers subsequently tested these names to see whether people could reliably identify them as Black sounding names, and they totally could. And if we compare them, according to these phonetic criteria that I've mentioned, we see that there is very much so the same pattern that has already been established for names in general and white names in particular. So here we see in green the results for the male names, and then purple the results for the female names. And as we expect, the female names have more open syllable, higher percentage of open syllables, significantly more, statistically significant. And also a higher percentage of vowels, although this wasn't quite significant statistically. And also for the high front vowels, although not for the sonorants actually, but 3 out of 4 of these criteria are going in the predicted direction. So this is a kind of confirmation of what we expected, that this gender difference would persist within the Black community. And then we can flip that and hold gender constant and look only at race and compare Black and white women. So this is another different data set based on names given to babies in New York State. So these are taken from birth certificate registries, but only women. And if we compare Black and white women, this time we have white girl babies in green and Black in purple. And we can see that here it's unanimous that according to these criteria, which make a name more feminine, that's always a stronger effect. That's always more the case for the Black names than for the white names. Quite interesting result, and highly significant in half of the cases, not quite in all of the cases. And the authors of this initial dataset study themselves speculate that this is driven primarily by the presence of the high vowel E as a suffix, like in Sally or small e, such names, and that this is an indication that Black women are considered more childlike and weak because of their social subservience, because of their social attitudes. But we can see actually that the strongest effect is not for the vowels, although there is an effect there. It's for this syllable thing, which is probably below the explicit notice of people. Okay, there's another data set, really wonderful data set available for Black and white women and their names in the US. And it's based on this early study, sociological study, which looked at university yearbooks from the 1930s and 1940s. And of course, at this time, all educational institutions would have been segregated. So you don't even need to try to go by a picture, which would not be really totally accurate anyway. Simply by institution, you know the socially assigned race of these women. And they compared and gathered the names of Black and white women from women's institutions, and singled out the names which struck them as unusual, which were specific to each group. So the title of this talk comes from there, because one of the uncommon but specifically white names was Darleen. And one of the uncommon but specifically Black names was Darnisha. And I think we probably share the intuition even today that Darnisha sounds more Black compared to Darleen, which sounds quite white. And so they exemplify that really well, even though they're quite phonetically similar in many ways, even identical for syllable. But then we see that distinction arising where there's an extra open syllable in the Black one. Okay. So looking at the most common names which they gathered for each group, we can see once again a confirmation of this pattern replication, where the Black names for Black women, rank higher on each of these phonetic criteria than the names for white women. So it seems that Black parents, over time, at least several decades, as exemplified by these studies, have chosen names for their Black daughters which sound more feminine than what the white parents are choosing for their white daughters, contrary to this social stereotype about race and femininity. Now let's look at everything all together, comparing both Black and white names and male and female names. So this is another study based on birth certificates from the same decade, 70s, this time in Massachusetts. And the researchers assigned race to each names, or Blackishness, whitishness, based on their statistical overrepresentation in each group. So it's not all Black names versus all white names, but the names which are overrepresented as Black and the names which are overrepresented as white, so sort of more Black and white sounding, then confirmed these by asking people, how do they sound? And we can see this very interesting progression. So starting at the left-hand side over here, we're going from the first column is white men, then next is Black men in purple. And we can see that, well, the higher the bar here, the more feminine sounding the name according to these criteria, open syllables to start with. So the name for Black men are more feminine, or maybe we should say less masculine, compared to the names for white men. And then again, the same pattern for white women and Black women. So we see again that the names for Black women are more feminine than for the white women. Same for men, Black men sounding more feminine by their names than white men. And that's repeated again for the vowel to consonant ratio criterion. And it's repeated again within the male group for vowel quality, but not the female group, very interestingly. And same for the other segmental criterion, percent sonorant consonants in the word. Very strong effect going the way that we've seen before within the male group, but not for the female group. Okay, the next step in this project, and this is just a sort of sneak peek I'm giving you now, preliminary data, is looking at invented names for Black people and whether they also conform to this pattern. And this first data set is one which I assembled based on the invented fictional names given by a pair of Black comedians to fictional Black football players. And you can see some examples of them here. Jack Marius, Taxtheritrix, and so on. So these are not real names, obviously, but they're names which are attributed to Black people by these Black people themselves, the comedians. So I wanted to know if these invented names were also following the same pattern, if there was enough implicit knowledge to not only choose among names for your child, for example, but to make a name sound more Black when creating it. And it looks like, yes, very much so, because what we see here is the dark purple bar is the invented names corpus, and all the other ones, the blue ones in various shades, are from the other data sets that I've mentioned already and a couple of more. And we can see that the purple bar is falling within that range. So implicitly, the comedians were able to identify and use these phonetic factors. Next step is to look at the Black names invented primarily by white people. and see if they also can tap into this knowledge, or if it's something that's really specific within the Black community. And so I collected these names from the summer camp sketches of Saturday Night Live, written mostly by white comedians. And we see that, again, they're following really to one end of the spectrum, at least for one of the factors, the strongest factor that we saw in all of these data sets so far, the percent open syllables. So they're very much following that pattern. And that's quite interesting that it seems to be something quite enregistered, we say in sociolinguistics, a acknowledged characteristic of these names. Okay, so to sum up, we've seen this difference between, based on the interaction of race and gender, where the Black women names are more feminine compared to the white names, and that's also true for the Black men, even though in both cases, this counters what we might expect from social stereotypes in mainstream, that is to say, white American society. And of course, we should think about why that is. And the first and most likely hypothesis, I believe, is that it's in fact a rejection of those stereotypes on the part of parents when they choose names for their children. Because these are quite offensive stereotypes, actually, which should be rejected. And they are apparently rejecting them in their name choices. And that could just be about feelings of self-worth, but also safety, maybe to try to make to minimize the perceived threat which white community members might feel if the name sounds less threatening, in other words, more feminine. Okay, here are my references, but I'll go back to the first slide so that you can see where to find me, and also where to find my slides later and other materials. Thanks again, and I'll be very happy to hear your comments and questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Marianne, for this presentation, for this talk. It was brilliant. It was very interesting. Do we have questions from the floor? Actually, we have a little bit more than 10 minutes, so you can ask questions directly, or you can type them in the chat. Let's see. Okay, there is a question. Catherine Davies.
Hello. Yes. Hello, Marianne. Thank you. This was quite wonderful. I had a comment, well, a comment and a couple of, mostly comments and one question. First of all, thank you so much for pointing out something that I was embarrassed to realize I had never thought about, which is the King Kong stereotype. That I've seen that all my life, and it had never occurred to me that that's what that could represent. So thank you for pointing that out. Also, the general trends that I was aware of about the perceptions of Black and white women, Black men and white and Black women. So I agree with you. I think your analysis makes a whole lot of sense, that the naming trends are a way of sort of going against those stereotypes, which create potentially dangerous circumstances for people. And my question is, I was thinking about the roots era and the awareness of African heritage and pride in that. And my impression as an American is that after that point, there began to be more names that I would have thought of as perhaps influenced by African. So those are my comments and questions.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think you're right about roots. And then, of course, also there was the Nation of Islam era. And so many Black parents were choosing Arabic-ish names without a lot of knowledge maybe of Arabic language or actual Arab names, but with a kind of gestalt view of what they ought to sound like. So that's part of it. And it's also been suggested that maybe part of these patterns come from a French influence, from Creole influence on Black names, which have their own phonological properties that could mount up statistically. So those are all things that could also feed into it at some level. Oh, I see there's a chat question about how I got interested in this topic. I think it was when I was teaching a course, Language and Gender, and it was one of these ideas that just came out of a classroom discussion, and already relevant to things we were talking about, but then realized this is something that hasn't been looked at. So very serendipitous, actually, and nice example of how teaching and research can really beneficially influence each other.
Thank you. There's another questions from Gerrit.
Hello. Thank you, Marianne. My question is about, I think you pointed at a really important issue about characteristics of these names, but I wondered how widespread are these names? Do you know something about the popularity? These may be typical examples, but if only a few people or parents choose them, it may be not that relevant. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, this will vary from data set to data set because, for example, the first one, the name's given only to Black children in Illinois, so that could be one child. Although they did still try to verify the perception of that name by giving it to people and saying, does it really sound, can you guess, what do you think, is this person Black or white? So that in that way, maybe if it's still identifiable, its frequency doesn't matter that much because clearly people agree on something about such a name, whether they've ever heard it before or not. In other data sets, for example, both the ones involving only women, it is frequency based. So those data sets single out the most frequent names for each group. So it wouldn't be a case of having rare names. It's a case of seeing which are overrepresented in each group. So in that case, there are definitely a lot of them.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
There is also a question and a comment here from Cleveland. Thanks so much for your presentation. I wonder if naming babies is even more considered women's work in Black culture in the US than white culture, which would mean women's preferences in terms of sound would have more influence.
Oh, that's an excellent question. And of course, I can't speak to that as an insider or as a matter of direct experience, but that would be an excellent question to ask. Who chose the name, either to the child or to the parents? Yeah, I could see that having an effect, definitely. And if it's possible to find out, maybe it would be worthwhile for sure. Thank you.
And then there is also another, sorry?
I'm making a note of that question in case I'm able to follow up and find out.
And then there is also another comment that's from Alexa Prince. It is ironic that I have heard a lot of people making fun of Black people with unusual names, implying that the parents gave those names carelessly. But these names actually have the ability to protect the children from harmful stereotypes.
Hopefully they do. Yes. Maybe that is what the parents are trying to do. And if it is, hopefully it really works. Of course, we can't know. But yes, there is this other really damaging stereotype about names chosen by some parents. It's very sad, actually.
I was also thinking about, those female names that are actually derived from male names by adding a suffix or a vowel or a morpheme, actually. So I don't know if there are like examples in your data of those male names. It's like the unmarked version, and then the female ones that becomes the marked version. And in that case, how would you describe those female derived names from a phonological point of view? I mean, it's just the last vowel, possibly an A, marking the female name that actually defines the whole name. Or, I mean, I was wondering about this combination of, male sounds in the first part of the name and then the female ending. How would you, describe that?
Yeah, that would have an effect, because then if you just add a vowel, of course, you're increasing the vowel to consonant ratio, and you're also adding an open syllable. So it could have an effect. Although interestingly, one of the things people impressionistically say is that names for Black women are more masculine, and they give them like Willie and things like this, which have E at the end, which sound masculine, but clearly that's not exactly the case. And then of course we see the same effect for the male names, where that could not be a factor because all of the names are meant for boys, and you wouldn't just add a vowel on to make a male name ever. Yeah, so I think it could explain some things between genders, but it can't explain the effects we see within genders.
Thank you. There's another comment here from Cleve. Even before the 1960s, when invented names became common, it was striking that male names that had British stereotypes for white Americans, such as Percy, Nigel, Reginald, and Cedric, were more common for Black men.
Yes, definitely Cedric, famously, and also the classical names. I have Caesar and ones like this, which is already something we see in slave names during slavery times. Very, very strange social pattern. But yes, and of course, those names were not always chosen by the parents. So there's a bit of a confound there, because there the question of who gave the name is even more tangled, because it wouldn't have been either parent, quite likely. But yes, that's true. Very interesting.
I just thought of another question. It's my impression that it was my African-American students who would more likely have a name that had some sort of unusual spelling to it. And I'm wondering if you've noticed anything about that. And I was never clear what that was about. It just made it harder for me to keep track and make sure that I got it right, although I was willing to do that. But I was wondering if this was a way of creating individuality or what. But do you have any thoughts about that?
I haven't looked into that, but it is certainly an idea that's out there, maybe related to the stereotypes about crazy Black names, that the spelling is weird or the spelling is wrong or different somehow. Although I'm not sure if that's really still the case. Now there are this kind of competing stereotype about white families, like, I'll type it in the chat, like, oh, I have to fix my keyboard, sorry. Oh no, why am I writing? I want to write to everyone. Kaylee, with lots of, extra, we could say, or like, Bry, all sorts of sort of stereotypical examples, which are now considered as kind of rural white names. So maybe that's shifting a bit in recent years. I just saw the comment about Ariel. No, actually, that Ariel was attested on both lists, which is quite interesting, especially because this is pre-Disney. And so it really wasn't a common name at all, either for boy or either for anyone pre-Disney. But it was something that stood out to these researchers and happened to be seen in both lists. I think it was the only one which was on both lists, which was quite striking. Yeah.
Okay, maybe we have time, just a minute for the last question. Here it's from Ernesto Cuba. Do you have information about how popular are gender-neutral names among African American and white Americans?
I don't have information about that, like which would be on both lists for men and women. There is this idea out there that maybe Black women are more likely to be given male names, but it wasn't a verified idea. It was just something that various earlier researchers speculated. Okay. So I don't know. That would take a separate study.
Thank you. All right. Thank you very, very much, Marianne, for this presentation. That was brilliant. And I think that also the discussion was very lively. So thank you.